The smoke alarm didn't save baby Oliver. His parents couldn't reach him. When firefighters finally reviewed the security footage, they found something that made veteran first responders break down in tears. Everyone knew Freya was a retired war dog, but they also knew she was broken, paralyzed by a trauma so deep she was terrified of the very thing now threatening the nursery. What this shattered German Shepherd did in the next 3 minutes defied every training manual and redefined everything her family thought they knew about courage. As the flames licked the wallpaper, Freya wasn't just fighting a fire, she was fighting a war inside her own mind. What the camera captured next made the world hold its breath, and it all started with a silence that was far too perfect. Before we get deep into the story, please let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Hit subscribe if you're hooked in and ready to enjoy this story, because tomorrow, I have another beautiful story to share with you and I don't want you to miss it for anything. Now let's get into the story. The false security Emma stepped into the nursery just as the Colorado sun began its slow descent over the Rockies, casting long honey-colored ribbons across the carpet. Everything felt right. Oliver was deep in his afternoon nap, his tiny chest rising and falling in that rhythmic, effortless way babies have. It was the kind of stillness that felt permanent, as if the walls of this house were thick enough to keep the entire world's troubles at bay. In the corner, Freya sat like a bronze statue. To a stranger, she looked like a formidable guardian. But Emma knew the truth. She saw the way Freya's ears perpetually twitched toward the door, the way her paws never quite settled, and the haunted depth in her amber eyes. She was a soldier who had seen the sky fall, and even here in a sun-drenched room in Colorado Springs, Freya was always waiting for the next explosion. The subtle shift Emma whispered a quick "good girl," and headed downstairs to finish some work, the floorboards offering a familiar, comforting creak. She felt a wave of gratitude. They had adopted Freya to give her a peaceful retirement, never imagining they were the ones who would need saving. But as the house settled into a deep, domestic hum, the air in the nursery changed. It wasn't a sound. It was a smell, a sharp ozone tang that didn't belong in a house of lavender laundry soap and baby powder. Behind the changing table, a single spark jumped from a faulty outlet. Freya didn't bark. She didn't run. Instead, her entire body went rigid. The scent of smoke didn't just signal danger. It signaled the end of the world she had lived through once before. As a thin gray ribbon of smoke began to curl toward the ceiling, Freya's eyes glazed over. She wasn't in a nursery anymore. She was back in the dust and the fire of the blast that took her handler. The cliffhanger downstairs, Emma heard a faint, rhythmic thumping, Freya's tail hitting the floor in a frantic, involuntary tremor. It was the sound of a protector who had finally met her breaking point. The smoke alarm remained silent. The parents remained downstairs. And in the nursery, a traumatized dog stood frozen as the first orange lick of flame reached for the edge of Oliver's crib. The sunlight in the nursery was too bright, too golden, too perfect. To anyone else, the way the dust motes danced in the afternoon beams would have seemed like a scene from a dream. But to Freya, every shifting shadow was a data point to be analyzed. She sat in a hard, disciplined crouch on the plush rug, her weight shifted slightly onto her haunches, ready to spring. She wasn't just a pet lounging in a child's room. She was a sentry. Her position was no accident. She sat exactly 3 feet from baby Oliver's crib and 2 feet from the door, a strategic angle that allowed her to monitor the primary entrance while maintaining a clear line of sight to the high-value asset she had sworn to protect. Oliver was 9 months old, a bundle of soft breaths and porcelain skin, currently lost in the deep, heavy sleep of infancy. He lay on his back, his small hands curled into loose fists near his ears, a faint whistle accompanying every exhale. To Freya, that sound was the rhythm of her new world. It was the frequency she tuned into every morning, the heartbeat that had replaced the frantic thudding of boots on gravel and the staccato rhythm of gunfire. Downstairs, the house hummed with the quiet industry of a Tuesday afternoon. Emma and David were in the home office, the muffled clicking of keyboards and the occasional low murmur of a conference call floating up through the floorboards. They trusted this silence. They trusted the heavy-duty baby monitor sitting on the desk between them. Most of all, they trusted the 5-year-old German Shepherd upstairs. They saw a dog who had finally found her forever home. They saw a hero who had earned her rest. They didn't see the way Freya's nostrils flared at every change in the HVAC system's scent, or the way her ears, tipped with velvet fur and scars, never stopped rotating like miniature radar dishes. Freya was a retired military working dog, a specialist in detection and protection who had served 3 grueling tours in the Middle East. Her resume was written in the language of survival. She had been the partner of Sergeant Marcus Chin, a man whose scent, a mixture of gun oil, peppermint gum, and old leather, was still etched into the deepest corners of her memory. For years they had been a single entity. Marcus was the voice, the hand, the soul. Freya was the nose, the teeth, the early warning system. They had cleared buildings in the sweltering heat of Kandahar and stood watch in the freezing mountain passes of the Hindu Kush. But the warrior's vigil had come at a terrible price. The final mission was a ghost that lived in Freya's marrow. It had been a routine patrol, or as routine as anything could be in a land where the ground itself could turn into a volcano. Freya had signaled, a sharp, sudden freeze, her tail stiff, her nose pointing toward a pile of seemingly innocent debris. But the IED had been triggered by a remote signal before Marcus could pull her back. The world had turned orange. The blast was a physical wall of heat that had thrown Freya 20 feet into a stone wall, shattering the air in her lungs. When the ringing in her ears subsided, the world was silent, filled only with the thick, black smell of burning rubber and the copper tang of blood. Marcus was gone. In the frantic minutes that followed, Freya had dragged her broken body back toward the fire, trying to reach the man who had been her everything, only to be held back by other handlers as the secondary explosions turned the site into a localized hell. She had been evacuated, treated for shrapnel wounds and a concussion, but the injuries they couldn't stitch up were the ones that ended her career. The military vet had labeled it severe combat-related PTSD. The once fearless predator was now a dog who whimpered at the sound of a toaster popping and hid under the bed during thunderstorms. She was hypervigilant to the point of exhaustion, her nervous system stuck in a permanent state of red alert. When Emma and David adopted her, the rescue agency had been transparent. She needs a job, the counselor had told them. She doesn't know how to exist without a mission. But you have to be careful. Fire, smoke, loud bangs, they don't just scare her. They transport her back to the day she lost Marcus. A dog like this might be the bravest soul on earth, but she has a breaking point. Her therapist warned us. If faced with her worst fear, she might not fight. She might simply freeze, her mind retreating into the trauma to protect itself from the pain. Emma had looked at the scarred shepherd, whose tail had given a tiny hopeful thump at the sight of baby Oliver in his carrier, and she had known. We'll give her a new mission, Emma had whispered. For 6 months, that mission had been Oliver. Freya took to the task with a devotion that was both beautiful and heartbreaking. She didn't play with squeaky toys, she inspected the perimeter of the nursery. She didn't beg for scraps, she stood guard while Oliver ate his mashed peas. The baby, in his infinite innocent wisdom, seemed to understand that his Fifi, the only name he could manage, wasn't like other dogs. He didn't pull her ears or chase her. Instead, he would reach out his tiny hand from the crib, and Freya would gently press her wet nose against his palm, a silent exchange of vows between the broken warrior and the vulnerable child. But today, the fragile peace of the Colorado Springs suburb was being tested by a silent, invisible enemy. Behind the white-painted wainscoting of the nursery, near the corner where the changing table sat draped in a soft blue cloth, an old electrical outlet was failing. A wire, frayed by years of hidden friction and a poorly driven nail from the house's original construction, was beginning to arc. It was a tiny thing, a microscopic snap of blue electricity that lasted less than a millisecond. Freya's ears snapped forward. Her head tilted, her gaze locking onto the wall behind the changing table. She stood up, her movements fluid and silent, the muscles in her shoulders rippling beneath her dark coat. She approached the corner, her nose working. Snap. There it was again. A sound like a dry twig breaking. To a human, it would have been drowned out by the hum of the refrigerator or the wind in the trees outside. To Freya, it was a tactical anomaly. She sniffed the air near the outlet. There was a faint, metallic scent, the smell of hot copper. It wasn't smoke yet. It was just heat. The dog stepped back, a low, uncertain whine vibrating in her chest. The smell was a trigger, a distant echo of the Kandahar blast. Her heart began to race, her breath coming in short, shallow pants. The freeze response the therapist had warned about flickered at the edges of her consciousness. She looked at Oliver. He shifted in his sleep, his little leg kicking out, his face the picture of absolute trust. Downstairs, Emma walked into the kitchen to pour a glass of water. She glanced at the monitor. She's up, Emma called out to David. She's checking the corner again. You were right, David. She watches him like he's the most important thing in the entire world. David's voice drifted from the office, warm and full of pride. That's because he is. She finally has something worth protecting again, Emma. She knows she's home. Nothing is ever going to hurt that boy while Freya is on the clock. In the nursery, Freya was still staring at the wall. The metallic smell was getting stronger, and now a tiny, almost invisible wisp of gray began to curl out from the plastic faceplate of the outlet. It was so small it wouldn't have set off a smoke detector for another 10 minutes. Freya's body began to tremble. The golden light of the nursery seemed to dim, replaced in her mind's eye by the swirling dust of a desert road. The smell of the hot copper was becoming the smell of the IED. Her training told her to bark to alert the pack to move the asset. But her trauma told her that fire meant death. It told her that Marcus had died in the heat, and if she stayed here, she would die too. She took a step toward the door, her tail tucked between her legs. The instinct to flee, the flight in the face of her greatest terror, was screaming in her ears. She reached the threshold of the room, her paws clicking softly on the hardwood. She could leave. She could run down the stairs, out the doggy door, and into the safety of the backyard. But then a small wet sound came from the crib. Oliver had woken up. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. He simply rolled onto his side, saw the dark shape of the dog in the doorway, and let out a soft, sleepy coo. "Fifi," he murmured, his voice tiny and sweet in the quiet room. Freya stopped. She turned her head, her amber eyes locking onto the infant. At that exact moment, a bright, angry spark jumped from the outlet, and a small, jagged lick of orange flame caught the edge of the blue fabric on the changing table. The fire had arrived. Freya stood at the crossroads of her soul, the door to safety behind her, the growing flames in front of her, and the child who didn't know he was about to die. Her legs felt like lead. Her vision began to blur. The smoke was thickening now, rising in a steady, lethal column toward the ceiling, and as the first real cloud of black soot touched the air, the smoke alarm remained chillingly, terrifyingly silent. Freya's mouth opened in a silent scream of canine anguish. She was the only one who knew. And she was currently paralyzed by the very thing she was born to fight. As the orange glow began to reflect in her wide, terrified eyes, a new sound began to emerge from the walls. A low, hungry roar that Freya recognized from the darkest nightmares of her past. The fire wasn't just coming, it was already claiming the room, and Freya was the only wall standing between the flames and the boy who called her his friend. But as she watched the fire climb the curtains, the warrior didn't move toward the crib. She moved toward the corner, her body shaking so hard she could barely stand, her mind caught in a loop of the explosion that had taken her life away once before. Downstairs, Emma frowned, looking at the monitor. "David? Why is Freya just standing there? She looks like she's seen a ghost." David stood up, a sudden prickle of unease hitting the back of his neck. "I don't know. Let me go check." He started toward the stairs, unaware that at that very moment, the faulty outlet had finally surrendered, sending a surge of electricity through the wall that caused the nursery door to slam shut with a violent, echoing thud, locking the broken dog and the helpless baby inside a room that was rapidly becoming an oven. The tragedy of an electrical fire is its quiet, calculated beginning. It does not start with a roar, but with a whisper, a rhythmic, almost melodic clicking hidden behind the drywall and the cheerful, white-painted baseboards of the nursery. Inside the wall, the copper was no longer just hot. It was incandescent, melting the protective plastic casing of the wires until they glowed like the filaments of a dying sun. The first true flame was no larger than a fingernail, a jagged blue and orange tooth that bit into the dry paper backing of the wallpaper. It tasted the air, found it rich with oxygen and the scent of lavender-scented laundry detergent, and began to grow. It licked upward, tracing the delicate floral patterns of the nursery wall, turning the peaceful garden of the wallpaper into a charred, blackened wasteland in a matter of seconds. Freya felt the shift before she saw the light. Her ears, those scarred and tufted radar dishes, tilted back toward the changing table. A low, vibrating hum began to emanate from her chest, a sound born of deep, ancestral warning. She rose from her military-perfect sit, her paws silent on the plush rug, her body low to the ground. Every muscle was coiled like a spring under tension. She approached the corner with a tactical caution, her head lowered, her nose twitching in rapid-fire increments. To a human, the air was still sweet with the smell of baby powder and the afternoon breeze, but to Freya's superior senses, the atmosphere was rapidly curdling. She saw the wisp of smoke, a thin, gray, insidious thread winding its way out from behind the changing table. It looked like a ghost, dancing in the golden beams of the afternoon sun. Freya let out a sharp, sudden whimper. It was a sound of pure distress, a crack in her disciplined exterior. She looked toward Oliver. The baby had moved, his small head turning against the mattress, his lips parting as he let out a soft, sighing breath. He hadn't woken yet, still cocooned in the blissful ignorance of childhood, but the air he was breathing was no longer pure. Freya took another step toward the smoke, her training screaming at her to investigate, to alert, to protect. But as she drew closer, the heat radiating from the wall hit her sensitive nose, and the thin gray thread of smoke suddenly turned into a thick, oily plume. And then the world broke. The smell of the burning plastic wasn't just a scent anymore, it was a time machine. As Freya inhaled the acrid fumes, the walls of the nursery began to dissolve. The soft blue rug beneath her paws turned into the sharp, biting grit of a desert road in Kandahar. The gentle sunlight of Colorado Springs was swallowed by a blinding, white-hot glare that didn't come from the sun, but from a blast that had happened 3 years ago. The smell of the hot copper and melting insulation was suddenly, violently replaced by the copper tang of blood and the choking, sulfurous stench of high-grade explosives. In her mind, the nursery was gone. She was back on that dusty road, the air thick with the dust of the explosion. She could hear the ringing in her ears, a high-pitched, agonizing whine that drowned out the world. Through the haze she saw Marcus. He was standing just a few feet away, his face etched with a look of sudden, terrible realization. "Freya, back!" he was shouting, but his voice sounded like it was coming from the bottom of a deep well. Then the secondary blast hit, a wall of orange fire that turned the world into a furnace. She remembered the heat, a physical blow that felt like it was peeling the fur from her skin. She remembered the sight of Marcus being thrown like a rag doll into the black, churning smoke. She remembered trying to bark, trying to run to him, but her body had been pinned by the pressure of the air itself. The memory was so vivid, so visceral, that Freya's nervous system simply surrendered. Back in the nursery, the German shepherd's legs locked. Her body began to tremble with a violence that made her claws rattle against the floorboards. This was the freeze response her therapist had feared, the complete and total collapse of the bridge between the mind and the muscles. Her brain was a chaotic storm of military commands. Alert the handler. Secure the perimeter. Extract the asset. But her body was a statue made of ice and iron. She was trapped in the 1,000-yard stare, her amber eyes wide and glazed, focused not on the fire climbing the wallpaper, but on the ghost of her handler disappearing into the flames of the past. The fire, indifferent to her agony, continued its ascent. It had found the heavy, decorative curtains that framed the nursery window, rich, velvet fabric that was nothing more than fuel to the growing beast. The flames took the curtains in a sudden, hungry surge, leaping 6 feet in a heartbeat. The light in the room shifted from the soft gold of the sun to a harsh, flickering orange that cast long, monstrous shadows across the floor. The temperature in the room was rising. The cool, controlled air of the suburban home was being pushed out by a mounting, pressurized heat. Oliver began to stir more fitfully. The thick, black smoke was now collecting in a heavy layer near the ceiling, slowly descending like a poison velvet curtain. The baby let out a small, sharp cough. Then another. His little lungs, so new and fragile, were already struggling with the soot that was beginning to fill the air. "Move. Protect. Move. Move," Freya's mind screamed. She could feel the heat on her back. It was the same heat that had scorched her in Kandahar. It was the heat that had taken Marcus. Every instinct she had, every ounce of her survival drive, was telling her to run. The door was right there. It was still cracked open, a sliver of safety leading to the cool, smoke-free hallway and the parents who would surely save her. Her muscles twitched, her weight shifting toward the exit. The flight instinct was a powerful, primal roar in her ears. But then she saw Oliver. Through the blurring veil of her PTSD, she saw his small hand reach out from the crib, his fingers curling as if looking for something to hold. His eyes opened, wide and watery from the smoke, and they fixed on her. He didn't see a broken dog. He didn't see a coward. He saw his Fifi. He saw the only thing in the world that made him feel safe when the lights were low. The cruelty of the moment was a physical weight on Freya. She was a dog designed by God and trained by man to be a shield, and yet she was currently as useless as the wooden blocks scattered on the floor. She watched a piece of burning wallpaper peel away from the wall and drift toward the crib like a glowing ember, and she couldn't even growl a warning. She was a prisoner of her own scars, a warrior who had been asked to fight the one enemy she couldn't face. The smoke detector on the ceiling remained a silent, white plastic disc. The battery, long dead and forgotten in the bustle of new parenthood, offered no salvation. The fire was now a living thing, a roar that filled the room, a predator that had finally cornered its prey. The smoke was dropping lower, now only inches above the top of the crib. Oliver's coughing was becoming more frequent, more desperate. He was crying now, a thin, wavering sound that was being drowned out by the crackling of the velvet curtains. Downstairs, the house was still a picture of suburban bliss. Emma was laughing at something on her screen, and David was stretching his arms, thinking about what to grill for dinner. They were 3 minutes away from a realization that would shatter their lives, but in the nursery, 3 minutes was an eternity. Freya's heart was drumming against her ribs, a frantic, irregular beat. Her vision was a kaleidoscope of fire and dust, of Marcus and Oliver. The guilt of surviving Marcus was now being overlaid with the impending guilt of failing Oliver. She was the protector who had been left alone with the baby, and she was watching him disappear into the blackness. The irony was a jagged blade in her chest. She had survived the battlefields of the world only to be defeated by a faulty outlet in a room meant for dreams. As the heat intensified, a sudden, sharp crack echoed through the room. The window, superheated by the burning curtains and hit by the cooler air of the Colorado afternoon, had developed a single, long fracture. The change in pressure caused the nursery door, the only escape, to suddenly swing shut. The latch engaged with a heavy, final thud, and the sound of the locking mechanism was like the cocking of a weapon. Freya was no longer just a protector trapped by her mind. She was now a protector trapped by the house itself. And as she watched the first lick of flame touch the edge of Oliver's soft cotton blanket, a new sound began to emerge from the dog's throat. It wasn't a whimper and it wasn't a bark. It was a raw, primal sound of absolute despair. But beneath that despair, something else was beginning to stir. A memory not of the blast, but of the man who had trained her. She could almost hear Marcus's voice, steady and calm over the roar of the fire. "Freya, listen to me. The mission isn't over until the asset is safe. Wake up, girl. Wake up." The smoke was now so thick she could barely see the crib, and the heat was beginning to singe the fur on her shoulders. But just as the world seemed to go black, Freya noticed a small, blinking red light on the security camera mounted in the corner of the room. It was still recording. It was capturing her cowardice. It was capturing the end. But it was also capturing a sudden, subtle shift in the dog's stance. A twitch in her front paw that wasn't a tremor of fear, but the first spark of a warrior returning to the front lines. The question wasn't if she would move, but if there was anything left in the room to save once she did. The slamming of the nursery door was a thunderclap that finalized Freya's isolation. In the sudden confinement, the temperature didn't just rise, it pressurized. The room was no longer a sanctuary of soft lullabies and stuffed animals. It had become a localized combustion chamber. Freya stood in the center of the rug, her paws anchored to the floor as if they had been fused to the wood. Her body was a study in violent contradiction. Every muscle was pulled taut in a defensive posture, yet she was shaking with a rhythmic, uncontrollable tremor that rattled her very bones. Her ears were pinned flat against her skull, and her amber eyes were wide, the pupils blown so large they nearly swallowed the gold of her irises. She was looking at the flames, but she wasn't seeing the nursery anymore. The prison of the past had claimed her. The smell of the burning velvet curtains, thick and oily, was the final key that unlocked the vault of her trauma. In an instant, the Colorado sunshine was replaced by the oppressive, baking heat of a dusty road outside Kandahar. The air was no longer thin and alpine. It was heavy with the scent of diesel, sun-baked earth, and the metallic tang of an impending storm. She could feel the weight of her tactical vest, the snug fit of the harness Marcus had buckled her into that morning with a playful pat on her ribs. In her mind, Marcus was right there. She could see the sweat beading on the back of his neck and hear the crunch of his boots on the gravel. He was humming a song under his breath, a habit he had when he was focused. Freya had been the one to find it, that subtle wrong scent beneath the sand. She had signaled, her body going stiff, her nose pointing toward the shallow depression in the road. Marcus had seen it. He had started to reach for his radio, his mouth opening to call out a warning to the rest of the patrol. Then the world had been erased by a roar that wasn't a sound, but a physical force. The memory hit Freya with the force of a live wire. She relived the sensation of the earth leaping upward, the blinding white flash that turned the sky into a furnace. She felt the searing heat as Marcus was engulfed, not by the small localized fire of a nursery, but by a volcanic eruption of fuel and high explosives. She remembered the way he had been thrown, his body silhouetted against an orange wall of death. She had crawled through the burning grit, her own fur singed, her lungs screaming, trying to reach the hand she could see reaching out from the smoke. His final words were a jagged shard in her heart, echoing through the years. "Good girl, Freya. Good girl. Protect." He hadn't told her to save herself. He hadn't told her to run. His last conscious thought was the mission, the duty, the bone-deep requirement to stand between the innocent and the dark. But Freya had been unable to reach him. The secondary explosions had forced the other handlers to drag her away, and she had spent the last 3 years carrying the crushing weight of that failure. She was the one who lived. She was the one who escaped while the man who was her entire world was consumed by the fire. Back in the nursery, that same fire was now dancing on the ceiling. The black smoke had formed a thick, roiling layer that hung just 3 feet above the floor, descending with a slow, predatory grace. Oliver was no longer cooing. The baby was awake now, sitting up in his crib, his face contorted in a mask of primal terror. The smoke was getting into his throat, causing him to cough in deep, racking gasps that shook his tiny frame. He reached through the bars of the crib, his small, chubby hands grasping at the air, his watery eyes searching for the one creature he believed could make the world right again. "Fee-fee," he shrieked, the sound a high-pitched needle that should have pierced Freya's paralysis. Finally, the smoke detector in the hallway, tripped by the soot seeping through the cracks of the door, erupted into a piercing, rhythmic scream. Beep, beep, beep. The sound was a siren of doom that shattered the peace downstairs. Emma and David, who had been laughing in the office just seconds before, froze. There was a heartbeat of absolute silence as their brains processed the noise, and then the sound of chairs slamming backward against the floorboards. "Oliver." Emma's voice was a raw, jagged cry of maternal instinct. They scrambled into the hallway, their feet pounding up the stairs with a frantic, uneven rhythm. As they reached the top landing, they were met by a wall of gray-black smoke that was already pouring out from beneath the nursery door. The air in the hallway was thick and hot, the ceiling invisible behind the shifting shadows of the soot. David reached the door first, his hand darting out to grab the knob. He pulled back instantly with a hiss of pain, the skin of his palm seared by the superheated metal. "It's too hot," he gasped, his voice tight with panic. "The door is jammed, the pressure, the heat. Emma, I can't get it open." "Oliver!" Emma screamed, throwing her weight against the wood. "Freya! Get him!" Freya opened the door. Inside the room, the sound of Emma's voice acted like a splash of ice water on Freya's soul. For a fleeting second, the desert of Afghanistan vanished. Freya's eyes cleared, focusing on the reality of the nursery. She saw the flames now licking the edge of the crib mattress. She saw the black soot staining the white bars where Oliver's hands were gripped tight. She saw the baby sinking to his knees, his cries turning into weak, muffled whimpers as the oxygen in the room began to vanish. Freya's internal monologue was a chaotic battlefield. "I have to move. I have to protect." Marcus said protect. But every time she tried to take a step, the trauma asserted its dominance. The sight of the orange flames climbing the wall triggered a physiological lock. Her brain sent the signal to move, but her nervous system intercepted it, flooding her body with the paralyzing chemicals of a freeze response. It was the ultimate betrayal of her nature. She was a dog who had faced down insurgents, who had hunted for bombs in the dark, and yet she was being defeated by a piece of burning fabric and a memory. "I'm failing him," she thought, the realization of physical agony. "Just like Marcus. I'm standing here watching the fire take him, and I can't move my feet." Outside the door, David was on his knees, his shoulder thudding against the solid oak door again and again, but the heat had warped the frame, and the internal pressure of the fire was holding it shut like a vacuum. He fumbled his phone from his pocket, his fingers trembling so violently he nearly dropped it. 911, what is your emergency? Fire. David choked out, the smoke in the hallway beginning to sting his throat. My baby is trapped. The nursery. My son is in the nursery and the door won't open. We're at 1422 Highland Drive. Sir, I'm dispatching the fire department now. They are approximately 6 minutes out. Can you get to a window? No. I'm in the hallway, the baby is inside. Our dog is in there with him. Sir, is the dog able to assist? Can the dog open the door from the inside? David's voice broke into a sob, a sound of pure, unadulterated hopelessness. No, she's a retired war dog. She has PTSD. She's terrified of fire. She's probably just as trapped as he is. She can't help him. Oh God, she can't help him. Emma was beside him, her face streaked with tears and soot, her hands clawing at the doorframe. Freya, please, she begged, her voice a guttering candle of hope. Save my baby. Freya, move. 6 minutes. The dispatcher had said 6 minutes, but in a room where the air was being replaced by carbon monoxide and the temperature was climbing toward 400 degrees, 6 minutes was a lifetime. It was long enough for the crib to ignite. It was long enough for Oliver's lungs to stop working. It was long enough for the story of the hero dog to end in a silent, blackened room. Freya heard David's voice through the door, The words, "She can't help him," cutting deeper than any shrapnel ever had. It was the verdict of the world. She was broken. She was damaged goods. She was a protector who had lost her teeth. She looked at Oliver one more time. The baby had slumped onto his side on the mattress, his eyes fluttering, his tiny hand finally losing its grip on the bars and falling into the growing heat. The fire was now a solid wall of orange behind him, the changing table a roaring bonfire that was sending sparks raining down onto the crib. The smoke was now so dense that the red light of the security camera was the only thing visible in the upper corner of the room, a silent witness to the tragedy. Freya felt the heat singe the tips of her ears. She felt the old scars on her flank throb with the memory of the Kandahar blast. She took a step back, her tail tucking tighter, her mind preparing to retreat forever into the darkness of her trauma. But as she backed away, her paw stepped on something small and hard. It was the stuffed dinosaur Oliver had been playing with earlier. The toy let out a faint, pathetic squeak under her weight, a sound that, in the roaring chaos of the fire, sounded exactly like the small dying gasp of a comrade in the field. Freya froze. She looked down at the toy, then up at the crib. The warrior's vigil wasn't about being fearless. It was about what you did when the fear was all you had left. Suddenly, the security camera captured something that the parents outside couldn't see. Freya didn't run for the door. She didn't whimper. Instead, her head dropped low, her lip curled back to reveal her teeth in a silent, primal snarl directed at the flames. Her eyes didn't look glazed anymore. They looked focused, burning with a light that was more dangerous than the fire itself. Just as the first flame reached the edge of Oliver's pajama sleeve, the dog made a sound, a deep, guttural roar that came from the very bottom of her soul. It was the sound of a soldier who had decided that today was not the day she would let the fire win. But the door was still locked, the hallway was still blocked, and the baby was no longer moving. And as Freya took her first lunging step toward the burning crib, the heavy ceiling fan above them, loosened by the intense heat and the warped mounting, began to groan, the metal shrieking as it prepared to plunge into the center of the room. The environment inside the nursery had crossed the threshold from a house fire into a localized inferno. The black, roiling clouds of smoke had descended so low they were now a suffocating blanket draped over the top of the crib. Every breath in the room was a cocktail of toxic plastic fumes and searing heat. Oliver was no longer screaming. His body simply didn't have the oxygen to sustain the noise. His cries had devolved into wet, rattling gasps that barely broke the surface of the roar from the burning walls. He was curled into a small, shivering ball in the corner of his mattress, his face pale and smeared with soot. One tiny, trembling hand remained pressed against the wooden slats, reaching into the darkness toward the spot where he knew his protector stood. Fee, fee. The sound was barely a whisper, a broken syllable of trust uttered by a child who was seconds away from slipping into unconsciousness. But to Freya, it was louder than the explosion that had shattered her life 3 years ago. That single whispered name, the name Oliver had given her because he couldn't yet master the R in Freya, penetrated the thick, icy fog of her PTSD. For 20 minutes, she had been a ghost in her own skin, a prisoner of a desert road 6,000 miles away. But Fifi was a word that didn't exist in Kandahar. It didn't belong to Sergeant Marcus Chin or the military or the war. It belonged to this room. It belonged to the boy who shared his Cheerios with her and slept with his head on her flank. Freya's ears twitched. It was the first voluntary movement she had made since the fire began. The rhythmic trembling in her legs didn't stop, but the direction of her focus shifted. The glazed, vacant stare in her amber eyes began to crack, the pupils constricting as she forced herself to look at the crib. The internal war was a physical agony. Every instinct for survival, every scar on her body, and every memory of Marcus's death screamed at her to flee, to save herself from the orange monster that had already taken so much from her. She could feel the ghost of the Kandahar heat, a phantom fire that told her she was already dead, that there was no point in fighting. But then Emma's voice shattered the silence from the other side of the door, raw and ragged with a terror that only a mother can know. Freya, please. Save him. Don't let him die. Freya, move. The pounding on the door was a heavy, desperate percussion, but David was pulling Emma back, his own voice breaking as he realized the wood was too hot to touch. They were inches away, yet they might as well have been on the moon. They were the parents, the providers, the masters of the house, and they were utterly, completely helpless. Freya looked back at the crib. Oliver let out one final violent cough, a sound that seemed to tear through his small chest, and then he went silent. His hand slid down the bars of the crib, hitting the mattress with a soft thud. That silence was the catalyst. In the absence of Oliver's voice, the memory of Marcus chin shifted. For years, she had only remembered his final, gasping breath and the way the fire had swallowed his silhouette. But now, through the haze of the smoke, she remembered a different Marcus. She remembered him in the training yard, his hand on her head, his voice steady and full of an ironclad certainty that defined her existence. Protect the innocent, Freya. That's what we do. That's who we are. Fear is just a smell, girl. You don't hunt the smell, you hunt the mission. The warrior's vigil reignited. It wasn't that the fear vanished. The fire was still terrifying, a primal enemy that triggered every trauma response in her DNA, but the love for the child became the dominant frequency. Her right front paw moved. It was only an inch, a slow, agonizing scrape against the rug as she fought the literal paralysis of her nervous system. Then the left. She was still shaking violently, her breath coming in frantic, scorched hitches, but the ice was breaking. The training, buried under years of pain, began to reassert its dominance over the trauma. Protect. 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 The word became a rhythmic command in her mind, a tactical objective that pushed aside the ghosts. Suddenly, the paralysis didn't just crack, it shattered. Freya let out a sharp, guttural bark, not a whimper of fear but a battle cry. She lunged forward, her powerful muscles finally obeying her will. She didn't approach the crib with caution. She hit the rails with the full weight of her 55-pound frame, her body slamming into the wood as she reached over the side. The heat was blistering. The side of the crib closest to the changing table was already beginning to char, the white paint bubbling and peeling in the intense radiation. Freya didn't hesitate. She plunged her head into the thickest part of the smoke layer, her eyes stinging, her lungs burning as she searched for the asset. She found the fabric of Oliver's cotton onesie at the shoulder. Her teeth, capable of crushing bone but trained for the soft carry, closed firmly but gently around the cloth and a small portion of the mattress pad to ensure she didn't bite the child. With a massive heave of her neck, she pulled. She dragged Oliver across the mattress, away from the encroaching flames and toward the far side of the crib. Once he was as far from the fire as the slats would allow, she didn't stop. She jumped into the crib, a space never meant for a dog of her size, and crouched over him. She used her own body, her thick double coat and her sturdy frame as a physical shield. She tucked her head over his chest, creating a small pocket of slightly filtered air beneath her fur, taking the brunt of the heat and the falling embers on her own back. But she knew this was a temporary stall. The room was death. She had to extract. Freya's tactical brain, sharpened by 3 tours of duty, began to scan for an exit. The door was a lost cause. She could see the orange light through the cracks, hearing the roar of the hallway fire that David and Emma were fighting on the other side. The air pressure was keeping it sealed, and the temperature of the wood suggested a flashover was imminent. She turned her head toward the window. It was small, a standard suburban casement window set high in the wall to keep children from reaching it. To a human it was an easy exit. To a dog carrying a 9-month-old infant, it was a mountain. The changing table was the only piece of furniture tall enough to act as a platform, but the changing table was currently the heart of the fire. The smoke was now so thick that the only way she could see was by the flickering, hellish light of the flames themselves. She had seconds, maybe less. Outside, the shift in the room had been heard. Emma, her ear pressed to the superheated door, heard the sudden, authoritative bark and the thud of Freya's body hitting the crib. She's moving. Emma screamed, a glimmer of manic hope breaking through her despair. David, she's with him. Freya's moving. David grabbed Emma's arm, his eyes wide as he looked at the smoke pouring over the top of the door. The door is gone, Emma. If she's moving, she has to go for the window. The yard. We have to get to the window. They turned and sprinted back down the stairs, their lungs burning from the soot they had inhaled. They burst through the front door and raced around the side of the house, their feet skidding on the manicured grass. They reached the area beneath the nursery window just as a shower of sparks erupted from the roofline. Freya! David roared, looking up at the glass. The curtains inside were a wall of fire, but through the shifting orange glow, they could see a dark, frantic silhouette moving behind the pane. The window, Freya! Break the window! Emma was on her knees, her hands clasped to her chest, her eyes fixed on that small square of glass. Please, she whispered to the smoke-filled sky. Please, just one more miracle. Inside, Freya had made her decision. She looked at the window, then at the child beneath her. She knew what the glass would do to her skin. She knew the height of the jump. But as she looked at Oliver's still, soot-stained face, she didn't feel like a broken dog anymore. She felt like a sergeant. She felt like a guardian. She stood up in the burning crib, her back fur singed and smoking, and prepared to do the impossible. She gathered the child in her jaws once more, her muscles coiling for a leap that defied every law of her biology. The ceiling fan above her groaned again, a final shriek of metal on metal as the mounting bracket began to melt away from the joists. Freya looked up, seeing the three-bladed shadow beginning to tilt directly over the crib. She had one chance to jump, one chance to break through the paralysis of her past and the physical barriers of her present. But as she prepared to launch herself toward the changing table, she realized the fire had claimed the legs of the furniture. The only platform she had was about to collapse. The security camera, recording its final moments before the heat melted the lens, captured Freya looking directly into the fire, her ears forward, her stance rock solid. She wasn't looking for a way out anymore, she was looking for the precise moment to strike. And as the heavy ceiling fan finally detached, plummeting toward the baby, Freya didn't jump for the window. She did something that no trainer, no vet, and no parent could have ever predicted. A move that would change the way the world looked at damaged animals forever. The heavy ceiling fan didn't just fall. It tore through the superheated air like a guillotine of scorched metal and plastic. But Freya, her tactical instincts finally overriding the shackles of her trauma, had already anticipated the structural failure. In the millisecond before the mounting bracket snapped, she had lunged, her teeth sunk deep into the wooden frame of the crib, and with a primal neck-snapping heave, she dragged the entire structure 6 inches to the left. The fan crashed into the floor exactly where Oliver's head had been resting a heartbeat before, sending a shower of sparks and pulverized drywall into the air. The room was now a kaleidoscope of hell. The fire had claimed 3 of the 4 walls, and the heat was so intense that the paint on the ceiling was beginning to drip like liquid wax. Freya knew she was running out of time. The mission had transitioned from guard to extract, and the window was the only extraction point left. But the window was 6 feet up the wall, a height she could normally clear in a single effortless bound, but not while injured, not while choking on black soot, and certainly not while carrying a 9-month-old asset that had to be kept level and safe. She looked at Oliver. He was barely conscious now, his small chest hitching in shallow, erratic gasps. The soot had stained his face into a mask of gray, and his eyes were rolled back, showing only the whites. Freya's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic rhythmic thudding that sounded like the drums of war. She positioned her body over him, her thick fur acting as a sacrificial barrier against the falling embers. She felt the searing sting as a piece of burning wallpaper landed on her flank, the smell of her own singed hair filling her nose, but she didn't flinch. A warrior didn't feel pain during the objective. A warrior only felt the distance to the goal. She needed a step. Her eyes, stinging and streaming from the smoke, locked onto the changing table. It was heavy, made of solid oak, but it was currently a torch, the padded top fully engulfed in flames. Still, it was the only piece of furniture tall enough. With a low, determined growl, Freya left the crib. She ignored the fire licking at her paws and grabbed the leg of the changing table with her jaws. The wood was hot enough to blister her gums, but she bit down, her neck muscles bulging as she began to drag the heavy piece of furniture across the room toward the window. Every inch was a battle. The rug bunched up beneath the table's weight, and the smoke was so thick she was operating on memory and instinct rather than sight. She pulled until her lungs felt like they were filled with crushed glass, finally wedging the table beneath the fractured window pane. She scrambled back to the crib, her breath coming in ragged, whistling sobs. She gathered Oliver's onesie in her teeth once more, lifting him with a gentleness that contradicted the violence of the room. She climbed onto the changing table, her paws treading on the burning fabric of the top. The pain was astronomical, but she didn't let go. She stood on the edge of the table, the child dangling from her jaws, and looked at the glass. Outside, the world had become a blur of panic and prayer. David was halfway up a rickety ladder he had pulled from the garage, his hands shaking as he reached for the nursery window. "Freya," he roared, his voice cracking. "I'm here. Bring him to the window." From the ground, Emma was screaming, her voice a raw, jagged sound that seemed to pull at the very smoke escaping the eaves. Neighbors had gathered on the lawn, some with garden hoses that were useless against the inferno, others on their phones with 911, their faces illuminated by the orange glow of the dying house. They saw it then, a dark, powerful shape appearing through the roiling black smoke behind the glass. Freya didn't hesitate. She couldn't use her mouth to break the glass because it was occupied with the most precious cargo she had ever carried. Instead, she shifted her weight and slammed her front paws against the pane. Thud. The glass rattled, a single crack branching out from the center, but it held. The window was double-paned, designed to withstand Colorado wind and hail, and it wasn't going to give up easily. Freya felt the impact shudder through her shoulders, her paw pads sliced by the metal latch, leaving a smear of dark blood on the glass. She tried again, harder this time, her body throwing itself against the barrier. Crack. She's trying to break through. David yelled to the crowd below. He hammered on the glass from the outside, but the frame was warped by the heat, and he couldn't get the leverage he needed from the ladder. Freya again. Hit it again. Inside, the situation turned from critical to terminal. A massive piece of the ceiling, a 4x4 sheet of drywall and insulation, collapsed directly onto the crib. The impact sent a fresh wave of heat through the room, and the mattress, already smoldering, erupted into a bright, hungry flame. Freya saw the fire leap toward the spot where Oliver had been lying just seconds before. The smoke was now a solid wall, blacker than a moonless night, and the oxygen was gone. She felt her knees buckle. The carbon monoxide was winning. Her vision began to tunnel, the orange light of the fire fading into a dull, distant gray. Marcus. I'm coming, Marcus, her mind whispered, the old trauma beckoning her toward the piece of the end. But then she felt a small, involuntary twitch of the child's hand against her jowl. Oliver was still there. He was still fighting. And if he was fighting, the mission was still live. Freya gathered every remaining ounce of her strength. Strength forged in the mountains of Afghanistan and tempered in the quiet afternoons of a Colorado nursery. She backed up to the very edge of the burning changing table, her back legs shaking, her fur catching fire in multiple places. She looked at the window not as a piece of glass but as the final enemy. She charged. She didn't hit it with her paws this time. She tucked her head, shielding Oliver against her chest, and launched her entire 55-pound body like a feathered-edge projectile. The sound was like a gunshot. The glass didn't just break, it explodes. Thousands of glittering shards burst outward into the night air, caught in the sudden violent rush of pressure from the fire. Freya's body followed the glass, her front half bursting through the frame and into the cool, sweet air of the evening. The sudden influx of oxygen caused the fire behind her to backdraft, a massive tongue of orange flame licking out the window after her. David, perched on the ladder, saw the explosion of glass and ducked his head, felt the heat sear the back of his neck, and then felt the weight of the dog hitting his chest. I've got him. David screamed, his arms wrapping around the limp, soot-covered bundle in Freya's jaws. Freya released Oliver into David's arms. The transition was seamless, the warrior passing the asset to the extraction team. But as David pulled back to secure the baby, he saw the horror of Freya's position. Her back legs were tangled in the jagged, shark-tooth remains of the window frame. The glass had sliced deep into her haunches, and the fire from the room was still clinging to her coat, the orange flames dancing along her spine. Freya, jump. Emma was screaming from the lawn, her hands over her mouth. Jump, girl. Jump. Freya looked at David. She saw the baby in his arms, saw the rise and fall of Oliver's chest as the fresh air hit his lungs. She had done it. The mission was complete. Her strength was gone, her blood was staining the white siding of the house, and the heat behind her was an unbearable weight. With one final agonizing pull, she ripped her hind legs free from the glass, the sound of tearing skin lost in the roar of the fire. She fell. She didn't fall with grace. She fell like a stone, her body limp, her eyes already closing. David tried to catch her partway, but the weight of the dog and the instability of the ladder sent them both crashing down to the grass below. Emma was there in a heartbeat. She grabbed Oliver from David's arms, her tears washing tracks through the soot on his cheeks. He's breathing. David, he's breathing. But David wasn't looking at the baby. He was on his knees beside Freya. The German shepherd lay on the grass, a broken shadow of the warrior she had been. Her back was a map of burns and deep, ragged lacerations from the glass. Her breathing was a series of wet, rattling thuds, and her tongue, parched and gray, hung from the side of her mouth. Freya, David choked out, his hands hovering over her, afraid to touch the raw, burned skin. Freya, look at me. The dog's ears, singed at the tips, gave a microscopic twitch. With an effort that seemed to cost her everything, she dragged herself a few inches across the grass until her head was resting on Emma's foot. She looked up at Oliver, her amber eyes clouding, her tail giving one single, final thump against the earth. Then her eyes rolled back and the rhythmic thud of her heart stopped. She's not breathing. David cried, his voice a high-pitched wail that was suddenly joined by the distant scream of sirens. Emma, she's not breathing right. Freya. Emma collapsed beside them, holding her living son in one arm and reaching out to the dying dog with the other. The neighbors stood in a silent, horrified circle as the first fire engine rounded the corner, its red lights splashing across the scene of a miracle paid for in blood. The warriors' vigil had ended, and as the paramedics jumped from the moving vehicle, they didn't rush to the baby first. They rushed to the dog who was still covering the child's legs with her own broken body. But as the lead medic knelt down and pressed 2 fingers to Freya's neck, his face went grim. He looked at the house, now a towering pillar of fire, and then back at the dog who had walked through it twice. He didn't reach for his kit. He reached for his radio, his voice steady but thick with an emotion that the world would soon share. "I need a priority transport for AK-9 Hero," he whispered, but as he spoke, Freya's body went completely still and the security camera footage, the only witness to her final stand, flickered one last time before being consumed by the flames, leaving the world to wonder if the warrior had finally found the peace she had been searching for in the one place she never expected to find it. The screaming of sirens finally drowned out the roar of the flames, as the quiet suburban street was swallowed by a deluge of flashing red and blue lights. The air, once sweet with the scent of Colorado pines, was now a thick, toxic soup of charred oak and melting plastic. Fire engines roared into position, their heavy tires churning up the manicured lawn where David and Emma knelt in the grass. A dozen doors slammed in unison as firefighters and EMTs hit the ground running, a synchronized army of neon yellow stripes and heavy oxygen tanks moving toward the carnage. "Over here." David's voice was a ragged, desperate rasp. He was still on his knees, his hands hovering over Freya's still, blackened form. "The baby is okay, but the dog? Please, you have to help the dog." The emergency response team split with tactical precision. 2 EMTs converged on Emma, who was clutching Oliver against her chest as if her own heart were providing the rhythm his lungs were currently lacking. They moved with calm, practiced efficiency, gently lifting the infant from her arms. One medic pressed a tiny oxygen mask over Oliver's face, the clear plastic instantly clouding with his shallow, labored breaths. "He's breathing," the medic confirmed, his voice a steady anchor in the chaos. "Pulse is fast but strong." Significant smoke inhalation and a partial thickness burn on his left forearm, but he's stable. "Another minute in that room, though." He didn't finish the sentence, but the look he exchanged with his partner said everything. Oliver was alive by a margin of seconds, a miracle measured in the time it took a dog to decide that her life was worth less than his. Emma refused to let go of Oliver's hand even as they secured him onto a pediatric gurney. She climbed into the back of the first ambulance, her face a mask of soot and tears, her eyes never leaving her son's face. She looked back at David and Freya just once, a look of agonizing conflict, before the doors hissed shut and the ambulance sped away toward the local pediatric ICU. On the lawn, the battle for the second life was much grimmer. A separate team of paramedics, joined by a local veterinarian who had heard the call over the scanner and raced to the scene, worked over Freya. The German shepherd lay on her side, her powerful chest barely moving. The physical cost of this sacrifice was now laid bare in the harsh glare of the emergency floodlights. Her beautiful dark coat was gone in patches along her back and sides, replaced by raw, angry burns. Her paws, which had stood on the furnace of the changing table and kicked through shards of reinforced glass, were a lattice of deep lacerations and charred skin. "She's in shock," the veterinarian muttered, his hands moving quickly to find a vein for an 4-line. "Respiratory distress is severe. She swallowed a massive amount of soot and heat." He looked at the jagged wounds on her hind legs where she had ripped herself free from the window. "She's lost a lot of blood. David, I need you to hold her head steady. Talk to her. She needs to know the mission isn't over." David leaned down, his forehead resting against Freya's singed ear. He ignored the smell of burnt fur and the heat still radiating from her body. "You did it, girl," he whispered, his voice thick with a sobbing sort of pride. "Oliver is safe. He's going to be okay because of you. Don't you quit now. Sergeant Marcus is watching, Freya. Don't you dare quit." The dog's eyes remained closed, but a microscopic tremor ran through her body at the mention of the name. It was the only sign she was still there. As the vet stabilized her for transport to the 24-hour emergency animal hospital, the fire chief walked over, his heavy boots crunching on the glass that littered the grass. He looked up at the gaping, blackened hole where the nursery window used to be. "My guys are finishing the knockdown inside," the chief said, his voice unusually soft. He looked at David, then at the dog. "Origin was exactly where you said, the electrical outlet behind the changing table. A slow burn that turned into a flashover the second that window broke. But I have to ask, How did she do it? The door was dead-bolted from the pressure and the heat. There's no way a dog understands how to drag a changing table to a window for a ledge. David looked up, his face streaked with soot. She didn't learn that in a backyard, Chief. She was a sergeant. She was a detector and a protector in Kandahar. But she had PTSD. She was terrified of fire. She spent the last 3 years hiding under our bed if we even lit a candle. The chief stared at Freya, a look of profound respect crossing his weathered face. She faced her worst nightmare to save that boy. In 22 years, I've never seen anything like it. As Freya was loaded into the vet's vehicle, the neighborhood, which had been paralyzed by the spectacle of the fire, began to find its voice. A woman from 2 doors down, clutching a bathrobe around her shoulders, walked toward the police line. I saw it, she told a detective who was taking statements. I heard the glass break. It sounded like a bomb went off. And then I saw her. I saw that dog. She didn't just jump out. She was holding the baby in her mouth. She stood there in the flames, making sure the father had a grip on the child before she even tried to save herself. She was burning and she didn't even flinch. Another neighbor, a man who had often seen David walking Freya on a short, tight leash, nodded solemnly. She was bleeding. When she hit the ground, she didn't even look at her own legs. She crawled right over to the baby and covered him with her body until the parents took him. She acted like a soldier. While the stories began to swirl on the sidewalk, a fire investigator named Miller was inside the blackened shell of the nursery. The room was a graveyard of childhood memories, charred stuffed animals, the skeletal remains of a crib, and the melted plastic of a diaper genie. He moved his flashlight across the debris, the beam cutting through the lingering smoke. He was looking for the cause, but he found something else. In the upper corner of the room, tucked into a mounting bracket that had miraculously shielded it from the direct path of the flames, sat a small high-definition security camera. It was scorched, the plastic casing warped and bubbled, but the lens appeared intact, and the internal SD card slot was sealed. Miller carefully unscrewed the mount and carried the camera outside. He walked over to the lead detective and the fire chief, who were standing near the curb. Chief Detective, you might want to see this. The Nest cam in the nursery was still running when the fire hit. If the cloud didn't cut out, we've got the whole thing on record. The detective took a portable tablet from his cruiser and connected the camera's storage. He hit play, his face illuminated by the glow of the screen. For a full minute he didn't speak. Then the color drained from his cheeks. He leaned back against the car, his hand trembling slightly. My God, he whispered. You need to see this. Everyone needs to see this. The chief leaned in, watching the grainy high-contrast footage of the frozen dog, the long, agonizing minutes where Freya stood paralyzed while the fire climbed the walls. He watched the moment Oliver spoke her name, and he watched the transformation. He watched a dog stop being a pet and start being a warrior again. He watched her shield the baby from the falling ceiling fan with a calculation that seemed more than human. This isn't just a rescue, the chief muttered, his voice thick. This is a miracle of the mind. She fought her own brain and won. By the time the sun began to peek over the horizon, the story was already beginning to leak. A neighbor's video of the glass shattering and Freya falling to the lawn had been uploaded to social media with the caption, Hero dog saves baby from fire, watch until the end. Within an hour it had 10,000 views. By the time David arrived at the emergency vet hospital, his phone was vibrating with notifications from news outlets he had never heard of. The vigil had begun. The family was split by the cruel necessity of the crisis. Emma was at the pediatric ICU, where Oliver was being monitored for lung damage. He was stable, but the doctors were cautious about the long-term effects of the toxic soot he had inhaled. David was at the veterinary hospital, sitting in a plastic chair in a hallway that smelled of antiseptic and old dog hair. He was waiting for word from the surgeons who were currently trying to debride Freya's burns and stitch the deep canyons in her legs. Hours bled into one another. The world outside was starting to roar with the story of the broken warrior, but inside the hospital, there was only the hum of the vending machine and the distant barking of a lonely hound. David looked at his hands, still stained with Freya's blood and the soot from his own home, and felt a crushing sense of debt. He had thought they were the ones helping Freya by giving her a home. He realized now that Freya had been the one holding their world together all along. Just after 4 a.m., the surgeon emerged from the double doors. He looked exhausted, his surgical gown spotted with fluids. David stood up, his heart in his throat. She's out of surgery, the vet said, pulling off his mask. She's a fighter, David. I've never seen a dog survive that level of smoke inhalation, let alone the trauma to her limbs. She's stable, but she's not out of the woods. The next 48 hours will tell us if her lungs can recover." He paused, looking at David with a strange, contemplative expression. During the surgery, when she was under the heaviest anesthesia, she kept twitching her paws. Like she was running. Like she was still in that room. "She was," David whispered. "She never really left it." But as David prepared to settle in for the long wait, his phone chimed with a message from the detective. It was a file transfer, a clip from the recovered security footage. "David," the message read, "we've seen the whole thing. You need to look at the 3-minute mark. There's something in the way she looks at the camera right before she jumps. It's like she knew the world was watching, and she wanted someone to see what she was doing for Marcus." David hit play, his eyes widening as he watched the footage that would soon change the lives of veterans and trauma survivors across the globe. But as the video reached the climax, David noticed a detail the police had missed. A small silver object that had fallen from Freya's collar during her struggle. Something that explained exactly why she had been able to break her paralysis when the fire was at its peak. The hospital waiting room was a landscape of sterile white light and the rhythmic hollow hum of industrial air filtration, a stark contrast to the grainy, flickering chaos about to unfold on the laptop screen. Emma and David sat huddled together on a vinyl couch that smelled of industrial cleaner, their fingers interlaced so tightly their knuckles were white. Between them sat Detective Miller and Fire Chief Holloway, two men who had spent their lives witnessing the jagged edges of human tragedy, yet both sat with a localized tension in their shoulders that suggested they were about to watch something that defied their professional vocabularies. "We recovered this from the internal storage of the Nest Cam," Miller said, his voice low as he hit the spacebar. "The timestamp starts at 2:17 p.m. You've seen the aftermath, but you haven't seen the 3 minutes that happened while you were on the other side of that door. Take a deep breath." The screen flickered to life. The nursery was bathed in that deceptive, honey-colored afternoon light. Oliver was a soft, still curve in the center of his crib, and Freya was the picture of military discipline, seated near the door. The first minute of the footage was a masterclass in slow-motion horror. At 2:18 p.m., the camera captured the first microscopic spark behind the changing table. Freya's reaction was instantaneous. Her ears snapped forward, and she rose to her feet in a single, fluid motion. But as the thin gray thread of smoke began to curl toward the ceiling, the hero they thought they knew vanished. Emma let out a small, strangled sob and pressed her hand over her mouth. On the screen, Freya didn't bark. She didn't run. She stood frozen, her legs beginning to shake with a violent, rhythmic tremor that was visible even through the digital grain. Her head was tilted, her gaze locked on the smoke, but her eyes were vacant, the 1,000-yard stare of a soldier lost in a flashback. As the flames began to lick the wallpaper, the camera captured the raw agony on the dog's face. It wasn't just fear, it was a total systemic collapse. They could hear their own voices off camera, muffled by the floorboards, calling out a cheerful "good girl, Freya," while on screen the good girl was a statue of terror, watching the fire climb toward the child she was sworn to protect. "She couldn't move," Emma whispered, the tears finally breaking. Oh God, she was right there and she was back in the war. She was watching it happen all over again. The clock hit 2:19 p.m. The fire had claimed the curtains, turning the room into an orange-tinted nightmare. The smoke was dropping, a heavy black shroud settling over the crib. This was the moment where the story should have ended, the moment where the paralysis of the past won. But then the audio on the recording picked up a tiny, wet sound. Oliver had woken up. He sat up, his little face contorted, and reached his hand through the bars toward the dark shape in the center of the room. "Fifi," his tiny voice chirped through the speakers. The change in Freya was electrical. The detective leaned forward, his eyes narrowed. On the screen, the dog's ears twitched. The vacant glaze in her eyes shattered, replaced by a sharp, predatory focus. It was as if a switch had been flipped, shifting her from victim of trauma to active duty. "Look at her feet," David murmured, his voice thick with awe. Freya took her first step. It was hesitant, heavy, as if she were walking through deep mud, but it was forward. Then the hesitation vanished. The footage accelerated into a blur of tactical brilliance. They watched as she lunged for the crib, her teeth catching Oliver's clothing. They watched the massive heave of her neck as she dragged the child to the safe side of the mattress. But it was the next move that made the fire chief gasp. Freya didn't just stay in the crib, she assessed the room. Her head moved in a sharp, scanning arc, checking the door, checking the fire, and finally locking onto the changing table. "She figured it out," David said, a single tear tracing a path through the soot on his cheek. Even terrified, even with her mind screaming at her to run, she was calculating the extraction. That's not just a dog. That's a sergeant. The final minute, minute 3, was a visceral assault on the senses. The room was now a roiling furnace. The camera, melting at the edges, captured Freya dragging the heavy oak changing table beneath the window. The sound was a grating, horrific screech of wood on wood that competed with the roar of the flames. They watched her climb onto the burning furniture, the velvet top a bed of embers beneath her paws. The first impact against the window made Emma flinch. The glass held. On the high-definition replay, they could see the dark smear of blood Freya left on the pane, her paw pads sliced by the metal latch. She didn't stop. She backed up, gathered the child in her jaws with a grip so precise it seemed impossible, and launched herself. The explosion of glass was a white flash on the screen. For a second, the room was filled with a sudden rush of wind that sent the flames spiraling into a vortex. Freya's body disappeared into the opening, her hind legs catching on the jagged shards. The camera caught the final agonizing pull as she ripped herself free, her blood spraying against the white siding before the frame went black, consumed by the heat that finally melted the lens. The silence that followed in the hospital waiting room was heavy, almost holy. In 22 years of firefighting, Chief Halloway said, his voice cracking as he wiped his eyes with a rough hand, I've seen 1,000 rescues. I've seen people do incredible things. But I've never seen an animal, or a person, fight through that level of psychological trauma to complete a mission. She overcame the exact thing that broke her soul to save that boy. That's not just heroism. That's something else entirely. Detective Miller closed the laptop, his face unusually pale. I've spent the night looking at this. Usually we keep evidence like this internal until a full investigation is closed. But Emma, David, people need to see this. We're in the middle of a mental health crisis for our veterans. We're in the middle of people thinking that damaged rescue animals are a liability. This footage? This is proof that broken things aren't weak. It's proof that love is the only thing stronger than a flashover. Emma looked at David. They thought of the years Freya had spent under the bed, the whimpering during storms, the haunted look in her eyes. They thought of how they had tried to fix her, never realizing that she wasn't broken. She was just waiting for a reason to be whole. Share it, David said, his voice firm. Freya would want it out there. Not for the fame, but for the ones like her. For the soldiers and the survivors who think their best days are behind them because they're scared of the dark. Let them see what a broken dog can do. They agreed to release a 3-minute edited version of the footage, titled simply, The Warrior's Vigil, A Story of Redemption. The viral phenomenon that followed was a tidal wave that no one could have predicted. It started on a local community page at 5 a.m. By 8 a.m., it had been shared by every major news network in the country. By noon, the hashtag Freya the Warrior was trending globally. The numbers were staggering, 10 million views in the first 24 hours, 20 million by the second. But it wasn't just the numbers. It was the comments. From a retired Marine in Ohio, I haven't left my house in 6 months because of my PTSD. Watching Freya take that first step toward the fire. I think I'm going to try to walk to the mailbox today. From a trauma surgeon in London, we often talk about integrating trauma. This dog didn't forget her fear. She used the adrenaline of her fear to fuel her love. This is the most profound psychological breakthrough I've ever seen captured on film. From the American Humane Society, applications for retired military working dogs have increased by 400% in the last 6 hours. The Freya effect is real. Global news crews began to descend on Colorado Springs, their satellite trucks lining the street outside the charred remains of the Highland Drive home. They interviewed the neighbors, the fire chief, and the paramedics. The world was hungry for every detail of the dog who had looked into the eyes of her greatest demon and refused to blink. But as the story reached a fever pitch, and the world began to hail Freya as a once-in-a-generation miracle, a strange development occurred at the veterinary hospital. A team of experts from the military's elite K-9 unit in Lackland, Texas, had seen the footage, and they hadn't just seen a hero. They had seen something in the way Freya moved, something in the tactical sequence she used to drag the changing table, that shouldn't have been possible for a dog with her specific training record. David was sitting by Freya's kennel in the ICU, the blue light of the monitors reflecting in his tired eyes, when his phone rang. It was an unlisted number from San Antonio. "Mr. Miller?" a gravelly voice asked. "This is Colonel Vance. I'm the director of the Military Working Dog Program. We've been analyzing your footage frame by frame. There's something you need to know about Freya's service record that wasn't in the adoption papers. Something about the day Sergeant Chin died that changes the entire context of what she did in that nursery. David felt a chill that had nothing to do with the hospital's air conditioning. He looked at Freya, whose tail gave a weak, subconscious thump against the sterile floor. "What are you talking about, Colonel? We didn't just find an IED that day in Kandahar, Mr. Miller. We found a journal. And we just realized that the silver object your dog dropped in the fire, it wasn't part of her collar. It was the key to a mystery we've been trying to solve for 3 years." David looked down at the small, scorched silver locket he had recovered from the ashes, the one he was currently holding in his palm. He had assumed it was a memento from Emma, but as his thumb brushed a hidden latch on the side, the locket clicked open, revealing a micro-engraving that made his heart stop. It wasn't a gift. It was a message, and as David read the tiny, etched words, he realized that the fire in the nursery hadn't been an accident, and Freya hadn't been the only one watching the baby that afternoon. The air in the veterinary intensive care unit was a thick, sterile silence, punctuated only by the rhythmic, mechanical hiss of an oxygen concentrator and the steady, haunting beep of a heart rate monitor. Freya lay on a specialized medical bed, her powerful frame nearly hidden beneath a landscape of white bandages and silver sulfadiazine-coated gauze. To look at her was to see the physical cost of an impossible choice. Her paws were wrapped in thick protective layers, her back was a map of treated burns, and a translucent tube delivered a constant stream of life-sustaining oxygen into her soot-damaged lungs. David sat in a cramped plastic chair beside her kennel, his eyes bloodshot and rimmed with shadows. He hadn't left her side for 72 hours, sleeping in 10-minute increments with his hand resting near the glass of her enclosure, as if his presence alone could anchor her to the world of the living. For 3 days, Freya drifted in the gray twilight of a medically induced coma. In the quiet of the ICU, the surgeons had worked to repair the deep canyons the glass had carved into her hind legs and to flush the toxic soot from her respiratory system. They called her the Miracle on 4 Legs, but David only saw the broken warrior he had promised to protect. The world outside the hospital was screaming her name, but inside, there was only the fragile, shallow rise and fall of her chest. On the 3rd morning, as the first light of a cold Colorado dawn filtered through the frosted hospital windows, Freya's eyes flickered. The amber irises, once clouded by the fog of anesthesia and trauma, slowly cleared. Her head moved with agonizing slowness, her nostrils flaring as she tasted the air. She didn't look for food, she didn't look for water. Her gaze darted frantically around the room, her ears, singed and scarred, twitching at every sound. Then a low, guttural whimper escaped her throat, a sound of profound distress that made the monitors spike. "She's awake," David whispered, leaning over the enclosure. "Freya, hey girl. You're okay. You're safe." But Freya wasn't looking at David. She was looking at the empty space beside her. She began to struggle against her restraints, her bandaged paws scratching weakly at the floor of the kennel. Her whimpering intensified, turning into a frantic, high-pitched keening. The lead veterinarian, Dr. Aris, hurried into the room, checking the vitals. He watched the dog's eyes, the way they scanned every corner, every shadow, searching for something that wasn't there. "She isn't looking for safety, David," Dr. Aris said, his voice soft with realization. "She's looking for the baby. Her mind is still in that room. She's still on the clock, and as far as she knows, the mission failed because the asset isn't in her sight. She needs to see him. If she doesn't see him, the stress of the failed mission is going to kill her before the burns do." While Freya fought her invisible war in the ICU, Oliver was experiencing a miracle of his own. Released from the pediatric hospital after only 48 hours, he had emerged with nothing more than a minor respiratory treatment plan and a small bandage on his arm. He was healthy, vibrant, and blissfully unaware that he had been seconds from becoming a memory. As Emma carried him through the gauntlet of cameras and reporters outside the pediatric ward, she didn't talk about the fire or the loss of their home. She looked directly into the lens of a national news camera, her voice steady despite the tears. "Freya saved him," she said. "She gave everything a living being can give. She didn't just walk through the fire, she carried my son's life in her teeth. We are just waiting for the hero to wake up." The reunion was arranged under a veil of strict medical secrecy to avoid the media circus. Emma arrived at the veterinary hospital 2 hours later, holding Oliver tightly. The staff made a rare exception, allowing a human infant into the sterile environment of the ICU. As they approached the kennel, the air seemed to hold its breath. Freya was still keening, her body trembling with the frantic energy of a soldier who thinks they've lost their comrade. Emma stepped forward, lowering Oliver so he was level with the glass. "Freya," she whispered. "Look, look who's here." The dog stopped mid-whimper. Her head lifted, her eyes locking onto the small, blonde-haired boy in Emma's arms. For a heartbeat, the room was perfectly silent. Then Freya's tail, heavily bandaged and stiff, gave a weak, rhythmic thump against the floor. "What? Twice?" The keening stopped, replaced by a soft, vibrating huff of recognition. Oliver reached out his tiny hand, his fingers spreading as they pressed against the glass. He didn't seem afraid of the bandages or the tubes. "You saw his friend." He leaned in close, his breath fogging the partition, and said the only word that mattered. "Fifi." Freya pressed her wet nose against the glass, exactly where Oliver's hand was resting. She let out a long, shuddering exhale, her entire body visibly relaxing as the weight of the failed mission finally lifted from her shoulders. She closed her eyes, a single tear escaping the corner of her amber eye and disappearing into her fur. "That's the best medicine she could get," Dr. Eris whispered, wiping his own eyes. "She just needed to know the mission was a success. She can start healing now." But as Freya began her long road to recovery, the world she had saved was being transformed by her story. The viral footage of the 3 minutes had become a global cultural touchstone. In the military community, Freya became a symbol of the silent ranks. The thousands of working dogs who returned from war with the same invisible wounds as their human handlers. Retired soldiers posted videos of themselves finally taking their own service dogs for walks, inspired by the dog who faced the fire. Active duty K9 handlers in combat zones shared photos of their partners with the hashtag #FreyaIsOneOfUs. "She did what she was trained for," one veteran handler wrote in a post that was shared 1,000,000 times. "But she did more than that. She did what she was loved for. She proved that a broken warrior is still a warrior." The impact rippled through every sector of society. Fire safety advocates used the footage to highlight the terrifying speed of electrical fires, leading to a nationwide surge in smoke detector checks. PTSD advocates pointed to the video as the ultimate proof that trauma doesn't mean a lack of courage. It means a courage that has been tested by hell. Animal rescue organizations reported a 400% increase in applications for difficult or traumatized dogs, as people realized that a dog with a past might be the one with the most to give in the future. The general public's response was a tidal wave of raw emotion. Millions of comments flooded the family's social media pages. People spoke of crying at their desks, of hugging their own pets tighter, and of finding the strength to face their own personal fires. The image of the Fifi moment, the baby reaching through the bars, became the most shared image of the year, a global icon of the unbreakable bond between two species. Then came the formal honors. The American Humane Society fast-tracked a nomination for the Hero Dog Awards, and the governor of Colorado issued a formal proclamation declaring a Freya the Warrior Day. Most significantly, a bipartisan group of legislators began drafting Freya's Law, a bill designed to provide federal funding for the psychiatric care of retired military and police dogs, ensuring that no hero would ever have to face their ghosts alone. The climax of the world's response came during Emma and David's first national interview. They sat in a quiet studio, Oliver on David's lap, looking exhausted but deeply at peace. The reporter, a veteran journalist known for his composure, struggled to keep his voice steady as he asked the question the world wanted to know. "How do you feel about the dog that everyone is calling a miracle?" Emma took a deep breath, her eyes shining. "We adopted Freya to give her a home," she said. "She had served, she had suffered, and we thought she deserved a quiet place to disappear. We thought we were the ones helping her. We thought she was the damaged one." She paused, a single tear falling. "But Freya is the one who saved us. She taught us that trauma doesn't define who you are. Your response to it does." She was terrified, you can see the paralysis in the footage. She was reliving the worst day of her life. But she moved anyway. That's not just heroism. That's grace. The reporter leaned forward. "There have been offers, Emma. People wanting to buy her, organizations wanting to take her for research, even her old unit wondering if she should be retired to a facility. Will you keep her?" David didn't hesitate. He looked directly into the camera, his hand resting on Oliver's head. "Keep her? Freya is family. She is Oliver's protector, she is our heart, and she is a hero. She isn't going anywhere. She's home." As the interview aired, a hush fell over the millions watching. The story of the broken dog had become a story of human redemption. But as David and Emma walked out of the studio and headed back to the hospital, David felt the weight of the silver locket in his pocket, the one Colonel Vance had called about. He still hadn't told Emma about the call from Lackland. He hadn't told her about the journal found in the desert or the mystery of the 3 minutes that the colonel said changed everything. He pulled the car into the hospital parking lot, his heart racing. He knew Freya was a hero, but the colonel's words kept echoing in his mind. She didn't just save that baby, David. She was finishing something that started 3 years ago. Look at the footage again. Look at what she does with her left paw right before the window breaks. David walked into the ICU, the locket clutched in his hand. He looked at Freya, who was now resting peacefully, her breathing deep, and even for the first time in years. He realized then that the fire hadn't just been a disaster. It had been a signal. And as he reached out to touch Freya's head, he noticed something he had missed before. A small, faint tattoo inside her ear, a military serial number that didn't match the one in her adoption papers. The mystery of who Freya really was, and why she had been locked in that nursery, was only just beginning to unravel. 6 weeks had passed since the sky over Colorado Springs had turned orange, and the air in the new house no longer smelled of ash. The scars, however, remained, proud, jagged reminders of a debt that could never truly be repaid. Freya moved through the living room with a slight, rhythmic limp, the legacy of the glass shards that had sliced through her muscle. Her coat, once a seamless mantle of mahogany and black, was now a patchwork of textures. Where the deep burns had been, the fur was growing back in thin, pale tufts, looking like frost against the dark earth of her skin. But the most profound change wasn't in her gait or her fur, it was in her eyes. The haunted, frantic scanning that had defined her for 3 years had vanished, replaced by a deep, quiet pool of amber stillness. Beside her, Oliver was a whirlwind of newfound mobility. He had transitioned from crawling to a determined, wobbly walk, his small hands often reaching out for balance. He didn't reach for the furniture or the walls. He reached for Freya. He would bury his chubby fingers in her thick neck fur, and the dog who once flinched at a falling spoon would now stand like a mountain. Her weight shifted to support the child, her eyes watching his every move with a calm, effortless vigilance. The warrior's vigil had evolved. Emma noticed it one morning while watching them in the kitchen. In the past, Freya had been hypervigilant, a prisoner of red alert status who was always looking for the threat she couldn't see. Now she was simply present. She was no longer on guard, she was just there. She passed the test, Emma whispered to David as they watched Freya let out a long, contented sigh and rest her chin on Oliver's foot. The fire didn't just happen to her, David. She walked through it and left the ghosts on the other side. She doesn't have to keep looking for Marcus anymore because she knows exactly who she's supposed to be. This shift hadn't happened by accident. Freya had become a focal point for a new kind of trauma therapy for retired service animals. Her lead trainer, a man who had worked with hundreds of traumatized dogs, used her case as a breakthrough. She didn't overcome the trauma by forgetting it, he told a group of visiting vets. She integrated it. For years, her brain was stuck on the moment she failed to save her handler. The fire gave her a new mission, a chance to rewrite the ending of her story. She faced her greatest fear and won, and in doing so, she rewired her own nervous system. She proved that purpose is the ultimate cure for pain. Freya began visiting other trauma survivors, both four-legged and two-legged, serving as a living bridge for those still caught in the freeze of their past. She would sit with a trembling rescue dog or a veteran who couldn't find his way out of the dark, and her presence offered a silent, scarred testimony. I have been to the fire, and I am still here. As the weeks turned into months, the nursery was finally rebuilt. Emma and David had designed it with their hero in mind. It was no longer just a room for a baby, it was a sanctuary for a guardian. A massive orthopedic dog bed sat in the corner, positioned so Freya could see both the crib and the door with a single glance. A wide, low window seat was installed where Freya could bask in the sun and watch the yard, the glass now reinforced and unbreakable. On the wall, framed in reclaimed wood, was a high-resolution still from the security footage. The moment Freya stood in the smoke, her body shielded over Oliver. When he's older, he'll know, Emma said, touching the frame. He'll know that he never has to be afraid of the dark because he has a warrior in his corner. One Tuesday afternoon, a heavy, olive-drab package arrived on the doorstep, bearing the insignia of Freya's old military unit. Inside, wrapped in protective tissue, was Sergeant Marcus Jen's memorial flag, the triangular fold of stars and stripes that had been held by his family. Attached was a handwritten note from his former CO. Marcus would be proud. You honored his memory in a way few humans ever could. You protected the innocent. You finished the watch. Welcome home, warrior. David knelt on the floor and draped the flag over Freya's back. For a moment, the dog sat perfectly still, her head held high, her ears forward. A A strange, dignified light filled her eyes, a look of absolute acceptance and peace. It was the final piece of the puzzle, a formal recognition that the debt of the past had been paid in full. The official recognition followed shortly after. A small, intimate ceremony was held on their lawn, attended by the fire department, local officials, and a few neighbors who had witnessed the miracle. The fire chief, his voice thick with emotion, pinned an honorary firefighter badge to Freya's collar. The American Humane Society presented the Hero Dog Award, a massive silver medallion that caught the light of the Colorado sun. As a representative from the state legislature began to read the proclamation for Freya's law, Oliver escaped from Emma's lap, crawled through the grass toward the guest of honor. He reached up, his small hand patting Freya's scarred nose, and for the first time, his voice rang out clear and certain over the crowd. "Fifi," he said, the syllables perfect and loud. "My Fifi." The applause that followed was a roar of tears and joy, a standing ovation for a dog who had taught an entire city that redemption wasn't about being unscarred, it was about being brave enough to stay. That evening, as the house settled into the familiar, quiet hum of the night, Emma and David stood in the doorway of the rebuilt nursery. The room was bathed in the soft, blue glow of the nightlight. Oliver was fast asleep in his new crib, his breathing deep and rhythmic. In the corner, Freya lay on her bed. Emma squeezed David's arm, pointing silently. For the first time since they had brought her home, Freya's eyes were completely closed. She wasn't twitching in her sleep, she wasn't whining at phantoms, she wasn't maintaining half-open vigilance. She was in a deep, peaceful, trusting sleep. "She's resting," Emma whispered. "Finally resting." "She knows he's safe," David replied. She made sure of it. They watched for a long time, the image of the child and the dog becoming a single silhouette of peace. Oliver's small hand hung through the bars of the crib, and on the floor below, Freya's scarred paw was stretched toward him. They weren't touching, but the connection was visible in the air between them. Two souls saved by a love that was stronger than any fire. They say trauma never leaves you. But maybe that's not the whole truth. Maybe trauma transforms. Maybe it becomes the very thing that makes you stronger when it matters most. Freya didn't forget the fire that took Marcus. She remembered it, and she walked through it again to save Oliver. That wasn't just a recovery, it was a redemption. And in the end, maybe that's what heroes really are. Not people without fear, but beings who love more than they fear. Freya taught us that. A warrior with wounds. A guardian with scars. A protector who knew exactly what the fire cost, and paid it anyway. She didn't just save Oliver that day. She saved the part of herself that thought she had lost the right to be brave. And in doing that, she showed us all that broken things don't have to stay broken. Not when there's something worth fighting for. Not when love says, move, and you move. Even when everything inside you says run. You stay. You fight. You protect. Because that's what love does. It overcomes. Always. The camera of the family's life seemed to pull back, leaving the nursery in a halo of moonlight. But as the house drifted into a deep sleep, David noticed something on the desk in the office downstairs. The silver locket he had recovered from the ashes. He hadn't yet told Emma about the hidden compartment or the words etched inside. He sat down and opened it once more, the small, scorched metal clicking in the silence. As he looked at the micro-engraving under a magnifying glass, his breath hitched. It wasn't just a message from Marcus. It was a set of coordinates that pointed to a location only 20 miles from where they were sitting. And as he cross-referenced the numbers on his laptop, a chill ran down his spine. The coordinates didn't point to a military base or a memorial. They pointed to a high-security private facility that, according to official records, didn't even exist. David looked up at the stairs, wondering if the accident in the nursery was part of a story that Freya had been trying to tell them all along. A story that was far from over. Freya spent 3 minutes in a literal hell to save a life that wasn't her own. She walked through fire, felt her skin burn, and faced her greatest trauma, all without a second thought. It took her 3 minutes to become a hero. It only takes you 3 seconds to show her the respect she earned. Most people will watch this, feel a moment of sadness, and then scroll away as if her sacrifice didn't matter. Don't be one of them. Like this video to honor her scars, comment, warrior, to prove her voice was heard, and subscribe so we never let stories of heroes like Freya disappear into the ashes. She didn't turn her back on Oliver. Don't turn your back on her.